Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. My name is Drew. I'm joined here by my co-host and my good friend, Alex. This week, we're going to be talking about a war and social changes that happen as a result of war. Kind of a big general topic, but the reason we're getting into it is because both of us recently saw the film 1917, which is a great film, by the way. I really enjoyed it. And we can talk a little bit about the film just kind of for fun later. But it got us thinking about how much of a change World War I was for the world, and especially those that were involved in it, and kind of the social stuff that came around with that. And also, it just got us interested in like other aspects of like wars that had big social change, and how in history it might be. You could make the argument that war is the biggest driver of social change, whether directly, like a revolution, or indirectly, like some stuff we'll talk about with some of these world wars. So it's a general topic. Obviously, we're going to miss stuff. There's a lot of war that happened in history, so, we're not going to hit every example. But it's just kind of a dark but kind of fun topic because of, 1917 coming out, and just showing all the stuff that happens in World War I with planes and machine guns and trench warfare, and what that might have done to change Europe back home after. So, Alex, any kind of starting thoughts? What did you think of the movie, by the way, in 1917?
Yeah, Drew. So I thought the movie was amazing. Going into it, I had a feeling that it was going to be similar to Dunkirk, which I was very split on. I didn't find it as good as some other people did, but I was blown away with this one. It was powerful, it was exciting, and it wasn't too long, which I think is an issue a lot of movies can have these days. Is 3-hour runtime is not always meaning a better movie.
No, absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, I liked 1917. No spoilers, but it does a great job of kind of personalizing war. It doesn't, most war movies are battles and giant regiments going out, but this one is the story of two gentlemen that have to go across the enemy lines to deliver a message. And so I think it really talks about the individual impact of war more than maybe what the impact to Britain was, And I think that was fun, powerful, and it kind of makes you really feel that war is just suffering and pain, and no one really wins.
Yeah, especially a war like World War One. And again, talk about 1917. So this has been, you're into the fourth year of World War One. It was interesting to see in the film, without giving away too many spoilers. There might be some spoilers here, folks, if you're worried about that. But without giving away too many, you do see how cynical and jaded the people are in 1917. You can tell that some of these guys have been in the trenches for a year or more, and they are just drained. Like one guy says, one guy gives the main characters a spotting flare for help. And he says, look, if you're going to die out there, don't lose this, okay? Before you die, throw it back, because I hate losing these flares. Just so nonchalant, like, look, if you're going to die, give me back my stuff at least. And you're like, oh my gosh, like, really dark and really cynical. And I bet you that wasn't the attitude at the beginning, right? If you look back, especially in the 1800s with the romanticism in art and literature, war was looked upon as like for glory and God. And there's these epic paintings of, leaders charging. And obviously I think people get wrapped up in that, the glory of war. And of course, throughout history, the military class has almost always been revered, and you want to be a part of it, right? You get a pretty good standard of living if you're a war hero and a general, right? But I think World War I was one of those where a lot of young kids, basically, like kids, 16, 17, 18, 19, went into World War I thinking it was going to be this epic grand adventure for the glory of their nation in 1914. And then by 1917, everyone had realized it is hell on earth, and it was for going nowhere. And it was a disgusting reality that no one wanted to be a part of. There was no glory in sitting in a trench and getting shelled for a month straight. So 1917, back to the movie, really captured how downtrodden and dark and abysmal the front line was on the Western Front.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, I watched it with one of my friends, and we were walking out, and she's like, I want anyone who is pro-war to see this and see the expressions and like you said, the true just cynicism, and then tell me that you think war is a good idea. You
Yeah.
know, and I think because we're now over 100 years removed from, well, the date 1917, we're 103 years removed from that. You know, and I'm worried people forget history. You know, I think there was a study in Europe that I think it was only like 1 in 3 like teenagers knew what the Holocaust was. And stuff like that just terrifies me because people don't learn. You know, history doesn't always repeat, but it rhymes. You know, and we need to remember how just brutal this war was. And you touched on it. I was watching a documentary a few weeks ago, and they basically said there was 14 and 15-year-olds even going because they thought it was going to be a quick war and it'd be a fun adventure to leave home and go out into the Western Front and fight for their country. And 2 or 3 years later, the smell of dead bodies building up and seeing your friends die and, you know, getting subjected to poisonous gases and brutal torture. I mean, it changes you, you know. And there's a quote I highlighted from that Atlantic article I shared with you. And the British poet Wilfred Owen, killed during the war, wrote that anyone who witnessed a soldier suffocating slowly from poison gas would never repeat to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. And he said, basically, it's a big lie that it's noble to die for your country.
Right.
And I think that's the big change. Like you kind of touched on it, is, you know, like our discussion question, right, for this podcast episode is war the biggest driver of social change, right? And, you know, I don't know if that's always been the case, but I think that's the story of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
You know,
So to think about, so let's dive into some, especially World War One, and I do want to touch on World War Two a little bit after. But so taking a look, like what were the social changes that arose from World War One? One is, I think, the mechanization and industrialization was ramped up immensely, right? I mean, at the beginning of the war, you had the French military was still had outlandish colors, and they were using bolt-action rifles from like the 1870s, right? They came up against the Germans that had Maxim machine guns that could, you know, spew out 400 rounds a minute compared to the French rifles as like 10. And then they were dressed in bright blue. They were getting slaughtered in the thousands and thousands in the first battles of 1914. Quickly, both sides of the Great War realized that mechanization and using technology would be paramount. So you literally went from having, you know, horses, like old school cavalry units drawing wagons of supplies, and within a few years you had tanks, right? Treaded tanks, cars and trucks. Planes using, you know, bomber planes, fighter planes with machine guns attached. You had gas. You had mentioned mustard gas was used. You had, you know, an incredible amount of mechanization. Machine guns, submachine guns, which are hand-operated machine guns. These are all things that came out within just a few years of each other because of the war. And it kind of changed Europe to realize, like, long gone are the Napoleonic days where you could, you know, have a drum line and your frills. Like, no, man, you got to get camouflage, you know, like get down, head down, you know, stop marching in a line formation, like build a trench, figure this out. And so as far as like just technology, World War One was a massive change. I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like to be that 15-year-old kid from the farmland. Then you go over to, you know, the front, and you're seeing millions of people die on a battlefield after being shelled for a month straight, and there's no trees left. Every single tree in a forest has been clear cut by just shrapnel. Like, it must have felt like you were on a different planet, you know, a hellscape. So, like, just technologically, it was huge. And then politically, I think it led to the attempt at making the League of Nations. I think Europe and America involved as well realized how quickly all these separate factions in Europe came into the largest war we've had ever seen, with like tens of millions of people dying. We needed to, like, guys, we need to have some way to talk to each other and figure this out before, you know, pardon my French, the shit hits the fan like this again. So it led to the League of Nations, which the United States eventually, you know, bowed out of. But it's like that was a precursor to the UN, a precursor to these international institutions that we kind of hold sacred today.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And Dan Carlin has just a great episode on World War One. Well, series of episodes. I think it's about 8 or 9 hours of material, so it's definitely hefty to listen to. But I think in school, there's more of an emphasis, there's more of an emphasis on World War Two.
Yeah.
I think everyone talks about World War Two and the Holocaust, and obviously the loss of life is unfathomable. But World War One, I think, kind of gets skipped over. Like, yes, you learn about trench warfare and the alliances that caused this, and the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. But like Dan Carlin and some of these other documentaries I've seen really put into just how important this war was. Like you said, war was almost kind of a game in the 1800s. That was before we had all these nation states, and it was kind of just a battle over small parts of territory. And then you had Prussia break up and the German republics begin, and they were just very war hungry and very nationalistic and much more advanced in military might and technology than the West, like France and Belgium and Great Britain, And I think no one quite fathomed how ugly it was going to get. And then you had Russians, just come in and just getting slaughtered out there, losing more than any other nations. And it's just alarming how bad it turned. Right. And the effects Dan Carlin argues this, and I totally agree, is that without World War One, we wouldn't have things like a unstable Middle East, problems with terrorism, and all this, because the impacts of this, it reshaped the global geopolitical sphere. I mean, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, which some people argue eventually would lead to the Muslim Brotherhood, and which would eventually lead to Al-Qaeda.
Right. Well, because after the Ottoman collapse, there was a void, and the British, which had helped the Arabs kill the Ottomans, they didn't really keep their promise, and they kind of just drew borders. And again, this is something that happened again in after World War II as well, which was European powers drawing borders in the Middle East. Yeah, that would lead to terrible, terrible conflict in the future. And then another elephant in the room as far as social change as a result of World War One was the Russian Revolution, right? At the beginning of the war, you had a czar. At the end of the war, you didn't, and you had Lenin in power, and you had a whole communist revolution in Russia because of World War One. People were fed up with the czar sending millions of people to go die while he sat in a palace. And then that communist revolution, changed the face of the earth, the entire globe for the rest of the 20th century.
Yeah,
we just had our whole discussion about Putin earlier. Our episode earlier this week. That's all because of the communist revolution that started in 1915.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's insane how influential impactful is a better word, World War One was on everything. And I want to go to theory for just a moment, just a little political science theory to add into this, because we're talking about social changes in war, right? And so it's a great piece I read called Total War and Social Changes. And total war is defined as basically the fact that wars have started to be waged incorporating not only governments and military personnel, but also citizens.
Right.
And so that's kind of this idea of total war, where it's not just, troops killing each other, it's civilians getting impacted, the environment getting impacted, cities getting just leveled. And it's this just idea of no one wins. Like in 1917, they come across that French woman and the baby in that village, like no one is safe from a total war. But basically, Karl von Clausewitz, he was a Prussian soldier and military thinker, wrote this great work called On War. And it was based on his understanding of war being one of the large-scale social phenomenon conducted by human beings. And in this, he talks about there are 4 dimensions of how this can impact social change. And the first dimension is the destructive and disruptive dimension of war. Destruction and disruption urge people towards the reconstruction of society, right? I think that's pretty obvious. The second dimension is the test dimension. And this is kind of the technology you were talking about. In the war, the military institutions directly related thereto, as well as the other systems of society, economy, and politics, would be tested as to their suitability and survivability for the conduct of war. This is where they're testing new materials, that's where we get many of our day-to-day products, right? It's from military technology and testing. The third is the participation dimension. War creates conditions which allow people who up to that time have been deprived of the right and power to participate in various social activities
Right.
to participate. And I think that's a really crucial one.
Absolutely.
And then he says the fourth dimension is the psychological dimension. People start to get the sense that war ought to lead to something new. And as a result of their suffering, they are shocked by war and trying to move on. And I think that's where this communist revolution comes in, the Bolshevik revolution, right? There's this psychological change, which I think you touched on well. And so it's just interesting how one war that no one fathomed or even accounted for just reshaped everything. And I think every war that came after it was, like you said, some repercussion to the Great War.
Right. Well, I mean, again, this is, we could go down this one rabbit hole real quick for years, but I think it's pretty well documented that the results of World War I were stepping stones to World War II, right?
Right.
The Treaty of Versailles and how Germany was disallowed to basically have a functioning economy. Again, we really can't dive into the details of this for those listening because it would actually take years. I mean, there are professors that dedicate their whole lives into the intra-war period. But it's pretty safe to say that the results of World War I eventually led to the beginning of the Third Reich and Hitler's rise to power in Germany in World War II. And so again, the social change, right, is immense when you're going from to the Third Reich. And then so I'll talk about participation in that point you just mentioned, kind of shifting gears, but to like America in World War II. A big social change was black participation in the war. They were not allowed to be Marines, but they were allowed to have. There were black units in the U.S. Army that were still led by white officers, but there were black units that fought the Nazis, and so when they came back, after the war, they had this understanding like, look, like I risked my life to fight this war, and now I'm treated terribly with segregation and racism at home. I need to take some action and it really helped bolster the civil rights movement that in the 50s, right? Because you had blacks participating in the same activities, social activities of wartime America, but they're not reaping the same benefits after in post-war period. It led to a discrepancy that they were like, hey, we deserve more. So, and then as far as participation, women were a big part of this as well, because of all the young men were sent to the front lines. Women had to take their place in the factories and foundries, right? That's where we get Rosie the Riveter. And you had a massive increase. For the first time in history, this is from digitalhistory.edu. For the first time in history, married working women outnumbered single working women, as 6.3 million entered the workforce during the war. And it changed and it challenged and changed the conventional image of female behavior. Before World War II, women were not, riveting things and building planes and making guns. That was definitely the realm of men. But after the war, that changed. And after the war, when some men came back, some women were like, you know what, I kind of like working and making my own money. And so you do have these, almost like there's the obvious examples, right, of like a communist revolution, right, where the purpose of the war is the social change. But there's also this periphery social change that we don't always think about as the result of wars, like the beginnings of feminist movements, the beginnings of civil rights movements, as a result of what you said is the participation in the war.
It's a very good point. I like that a lot, and it's true. I mean, my grandma on my dad's side, I never met her because she died before I was born, but she was one of these ladies. Yes, there was, working in manufacturing and factories, helping do this because, yes, there was a need. And I think, like you said, this peripheral change was almost crucial to the U.S. progressing to a more positive light. And it's really cool to see, and this, now I'm jumping forward a little bit to the Vietnam War, but there's a similar almost positive societal change that came out of it for this fact as well. And I'm glad you touched on race, because the same way I think the civil rights movement was, kind of engaged by this participation by blacks during the war, the same thing happened with Mexicans during the Vietnam War.
Right.
there's an interesting New York Times article I read. It's called Vietnam, the War That Killed Trust. And I want to talk about that a little bit later. But for the moment, he says one of the only pros of this is written by a doctor who at the time was a medic in Vietnam. And he said one of the only positives he got out of the experience was he was with a Mexican in his group in Vietnam, and the Mexican offered him a tamale, and he was like, "What is a tamale? I've never seen this before." And they just had this nice conversation, and he tried a tamale for the first time. This is a guy that was from Middle America, had not met a lot of minorities, and he said just this ceremonial sharing of a tamale really kind of opened his eyes to how racism is bad and how we need to move past it. And unfortunately, like the downside of that is that war, usually the people that are now going more and more are poor minorities. Like it's an unfortunate side effect, like where your Yale students or your Harvard students aren't really signing up too quickly.
No.
And so now that is a problem of it, is now people that maybe don't have other options are now the ones that are the first ones to be enlisting. But it is true, the participation is a nice side effect. And since then, now we have women leaders and active women involvement in the military, and I think that participation is a crucial, like, peripheral effect. So we'll see, but I do like that point a lot.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, you're right though. It's been a fascinating thing that in times of war, the military obviously needs people to be a part of it. And so they offer, look, we don't care if you're, brown, black, white, whatever. We just need help. And that can be the escape hatch out of poverty for a lot of people. And then once you're out that hatch, it's like, hey man, like I gave up I put my life on the line for this. Like, you better pay me back. And that's where, and so, yeah, a lot of social change comes from that participation. It's very fascinating. It's very fascinating. Like the periphery stuff around some of these wars, and economically, right? World War II kind of brought the United States out of the Great Depression, and with like the GI Bill and stuff, you had a lot of young men coming back from the war that were able to get an education very cheaply. Were able to have a steady income and a good economy, a post-war economy, and that led to kind of the domestic household and like the quote-unquote golden era we talk about during like Eisenhower's presidency, where people were buying fridges and microwaves and buying cars, and American automakers were at their prime. And like we talked about African Americans in these wars, like after World War II, a lot of African Americans moved out of the South to the north, to places like Chicago and Detroit, to chase these new industrial jobs, to work in the auto industry, to work for GM in Detroit when it was booming. And so we still see a lot of African Americans in these cities like Detroit and Chicago today because of the social changes that happened 60 years ago. And so it is really fascinating to see so much change come from wars that weren't the point of the war.
That's a very good point, and I almost feel like that's where that nostalgia that people like Trump have appealed to, the Make America Great Again, it was this time of just a giant societal change in the United States. And, I think a lot of people, even ones that maybe didn't grow up there, feel this kind of burning nostalgia for a time when people were actively involved. They loved their country. We had just defeated evil, the Nazi regime. And there is probably a sense that really did, I think it was after World War II that America was really, feeling themselves.
Feeling good.
For not a better word, and so like going on, because I wanted to talk about Vietnam really quickly as well, but I think like we've talked about, one thing led to another. I think that's the story of the 20th century, is we're at where we're at now because of these conflicts that have slowly been evolving society. And that was not probably the same in the 1800s. It's like World War I created a divided and unstable world dynamic, which created World War II. And then World War II led to a kind of a rift between the East and the West. The Cold War led to a distrust in political institutions, and the Gulf War and 9/11 were an outcome of that, which led to security and surveillance.
Right.
And so like I just wanted to touch on Vietnam because I think it's worth mentioning that Vietnam was pretty much the war that killed trust.
Yes.
Right. Because World War II, I was talking to a guy when I was back home, a veteran, and he was basically like, World War II was the last good war. And I'm not saying good war as in, because no war is good, but it was the less easy war. It was the last black and white war. It was us versus Nazis that were putting Jewish people into concentration camps. Like there was an easy bad guy, right?
Right. There's an easy justification for action.
Exactly. But Vietnam and the Korea, even which preceded it, there was a change, right? There's a lot of questions as to why we were even in Vietnam. But America didn't just lose Vietnam and the lives of over 58,000 young men and women, but Vietnam seems to kind of changed us as a country.
Absolutely.
And the Cato Institute actually has an interesting piece on Henry Kissinger having a somber discussion about Vietnam. And for people who don't know, Henry Kissinger, controversial but very brilliant Secretary of State during this time under Richard Nixon. And he had a somber reassessment of America's involvement in Southeast Asia. And he said he regrets that what should have been straightforward, pretty much turned into a moral issue, right? The moral adequacy of American foreign policy. And then he goes on to say, to me, the tragedy of the Vietnam War was not that there were disagreements. That was inevitable, given the complexity of the conflict. But he said, but that the faith of Americans in each other became destroyed in the process. And it's an interesting point is a writer, Randolph Bourne, famously declared during World War I that war is the health of the state. And I think that is a very, very adequate point, is that Vietnam, for example, it was basically the thermometer of the United States. And it was not good. It was not a healthy nation. It was a nation that was afraid of communism, the Red Scare. We had just got out of McCarthyism, and I think we were an unhealthy nation. And the same could be said going down the road to 9/11 after, the Gulf War. And you kind of have to think is that sometimes the changes, I know we've talked about some of the positive changes, but some of the negative changes are also quite
absolutely.
Dark,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I just think 9/11, for example, wouldn't have happened if Vietnam hadn't have happened. And now what the Uyghurs, like we talked about last week, and all this stuff is just a growth of this surveillance state that was almost created after 9/11. And I think the world changed forever after that.
Yes, absolutely. The social change, like you said, Vietnam. I mean, combined with a couple things, like not long after our main involvement in Vietnam, Nixon was impeached and then left the presidency. You had a massive rift in the nation, as like you said, of trust. And that's been continuing since, especially post 9/11 with the NSA security state and the Patriot Act and the unbelievable amount of like the security apparatus and like the amount of security we take, and like the fact that you have to basically get strip searched to get on a plane. Yeah, that's led to a lot of social change. I mean, people do have a distrust for the American government and large governments in general. But on top of that, I think we have like the UN, especially the EU, it's very coalesced. It's less divided now. There's obviously struggles right now. We've talked about how the East versus West and the Belt and Road and all that. But like, I think overall the wars in the 20th century have eventually led to a safer, more stable world. That doesn't always seem like that at times, but I think it's a lot harder to end up with a World War I today than it was 100 years ago. Did you kind of get what I'm getting at?
Yes. I think that's what the story of the 20th century is this evolution to probably more stability. Through instability, it's bred stability.
Right. It's the pendulum swing. And hopefully it doesn't swing back to instability too soon, but I think that's kind of what we're seeing. Yeah, I mean, it's very, very interesting, the relationship of like the average American to the government and what they believe and trust has changed a lot, especially with Vietnam and 9/11 and the Iraq War. But I also think, thankfully, we don't have to have World War I's and World War II's as common anymore because of the institutions we created after those.
Yeah, and I mean, on that point, I think there's a lot more progressive millennials here, very against borders and the nation state. But I mean, the counter I would have to that is kind of this whole point is that it's actually been through the creation of nation states and borders and acceptance of borders that has almost made war inevitably less likely, right? Because, back in the 19th century or the 18th century, it was there were a lot of land grabs. There was a lot of changing of borders, a lot of changing of land, a lot of region states, papal states. And war was just very likely because there was no groundwork or rules for people to work around. And so I actually think this nationalism, not the dark nationalism, but the idea of a nation state and a group of nation states that work together, it just makes it harder in general to do a world war, especially now that we have nuclear weapons and just the technology that we have.
Right. There's obviously the democratic peace theory that, we know that in general and so far the democratic states do not go to war with other democratic states. Now, obviously, like we talked about with Russia, the definition of what a democratic state is might be changing. But yes, I think you're right that like it requires powerful states and multiple powerful states to work together. They can prevent smaller periphery wars and the instability that can lead to world wars. So, hopefully we never have to see a World War I and a World War II again because we've already been through it. Hopefully we don't rhyme that poem. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that war is a massive driver of social change. Now, obviously, in this discussion, we've really mainly focused on the 20th century, so we're probably forgetting some of the, the big ones. I think one big one we didn't really talk about was the Civil War, which caused a ton of social change in the United States. We could talk about the Crusades. There's plenty to go about in history, but I think just because we saw 1917, it was on our minds, and I thought it would be a fun topic to kind of talk about some of the massive social changes war has had in the 20th century. Any final thoughts before we get on out of here?
Well, I actually just one last thing about 1917 actually is that I was thinking about this while you were saying that, and I think what I liked about it is you see a lot of war movies that kind of romanticize war.
Yes.
Like I was a huge fan of the movie Lone Survivor. But at the end of the day, it romanticizes one man's survival against the Taliban, and it kind of makes you think, okay, maybe we're over there for a reason. But this movie was the opposite. It made you think, F this. Like, just when they're running out in these open fields, afraid of, German shots and bombs and machine guns, you're just going, there is nothing romantic about this. This is just bleak and sad.
No, when you're taking cover behind a corpse of a horse, it's just trudging through the mud that's filled with like half blown up bodies. No, it's definitely not romantic at all. And I think you're right. I think the movie definitely captured the real ambiance of that war, which was hell, literally hell on earth. And no one was smiling. Even the beginning scene before they go over the trench, the commanding officer is like losing it. Like the commanding officer is crying and like having a manic attack, and they're trying to talk to him like Captain, and he just like shuts him out. Like that was a good thing of like, oh my gosh, not even the leaders want to be there. Anyway, yeah, 1917, a great film, really captures the bleak, dark reality that was the First World War. I recommend it, and it was also cool to see it all in like that one shot kind of style, where it's kind of the following them and all those takes. Anyway, that's more of a film discussion, but fascinating movie, very good. I recommend everyone see it.
Yep, I think that's about it. And like always, guys, please leave your comments. Tell us what you think. It helps the algorithms help us get towards the top more. Tell your friends, tell your family, and let us know what you think on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, YouTube, and other third-party sites. So please keep listening, and yeah, we'd love your feedback.
Take care, everyone. Tune in next week.